The Unconventional Therapist's Guide to Nothing.
Hey everybody, this is The Unconventional Therapist. I am your host, Dave. I'm joined with my co-host, Greg. Greg, how are you, man?
You know, I went somewhere this weekend and I was shocked I didn't run into you.
Would you go to some oddities thing?
I did.
Yeah. In Providence.
Did you go there?
I went to a different one. I almost went to that one. I did not go to that one.
I gotta be honest. It was I really liked it, but it was kind of all the same thing over and over again.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was like a lot. The taxidermy I kind of got into a little bit. I got a crocodile head and a puffer fish. But everything else was like sort of the same kind of stuff. But it was fun. It was a cool vibe, and I kind of really like the people. You know, the people who are into like the dark stuff. There's something like oddly endearing about them. They seem really nice.
Yeah.
Which you wouldn't really kind of suppose, right?
I have a taxidermy squirrel and a baby possum in a jar that we walked away with this weekend.
Yeah, see, yeah, we were kind of in the I'll tell you what else I got. A minx penis bone. But the only reason why I got that is because I brought the kids and they wanted to get, there was like this thing where it was like surprise. You just get these little boxes and there was like a surprise.
Yeah.
And then I was driving home and then from the back seat, someone was like, I got a minx penis. And I was like, excuse me? And they did. That's what they had.
Very
yeah. So I mean, it was fun. And Dave, I'm sorry, how are you? How was your weekend?
My weekend was okay. Right. Greg, on the social media, we've been asking some people questions here and there. Mm-hmm. And, you know, sometimes we get some interesting responses. I don't know if you happen to catch one of the posts that we made, but it was about reasons people might have changed therapists.
Yeah.
Did you happen to read any of the responses?
I did, and I don't know which one you're talking about specifically.
There was a few that really were like, wow, I think we're doing okay.
Yeah.
If that's if that's other therapist behavior, I think we're doing okay.
Yeah, we're doing fine. None of that stuff.
I was like, wow, I wouldn't even have thought to say some of those things.
Yeah.
Or like, do you want to have patients or not? Like, do you want to have clients
Well, that's what's scary sometimes. Like people are so, you know, anxious to get a therapist that sometimes they'll take what they can get, and not always is it super easy to move, because then there's going to be like a long waiting period and sometimes people feel stuck. But it really is important. I mean, all the research points to not CBT, DBT, anything along those lines. Just developing that relationship is the most important thing. I honestly believe that once people start to feel heard and understood, immediately that's when they begin to heal. That's where the magic happens, right? Where someone's like, I have a place where I can really just kind of unload. And it doesn't really matter what kind of interventions we're going to use or what theoretical approach. What matters is we're ready to listen and we're ready to try to understand.
I'm trying to remember what country the person responded from. There was one that was from another country, and he said they're very into psychoanalytic style. Which I thought was interesting because
must have a lot of time on his hands. That's the long haul. That's the long haul.
No,
right?
he said that they're all like that. Like that's a big style for their therapists over there.
And where? Probably Germany, right? Freud?
No, it was not actually. Let me see. I want to say it was like, oh, I wish I had that ready when we
Vienna is what I meant.
It actually wasn't. I can't remember. But anyways, it wasn't somewhere where I would expected it, but it was just a very interesting thing like that.
I can see how that could be like a cultural thing where it's like, you know, in America, we're so much in a rush. And plus, I think the reason for a lot of these developments of these faster approaches is money, you know, insurance, you know?
Yeah. So. Yeah. And, you know, a lot of people kind of go back to this idea that they really like CBT. And I just want to like encourage people, you don't have to like go all in on one thing. Like you said, it's not so much about this approach. Take the tools from whatever you can, because there's so many things out there that are useful. and maybe it's just about it being worded in a different way, because a lot of the things are even like similar concepts. But like,
completely similar.
yeah, just, don't go all in and be like, this is my thing. Like, be curious and be open-minded to other approaches, right?
Yeah, and I mean, the best therapists, in my opinion, are the ones that use the tools that are necessary, right? Like, when I was in the Navy, there was this like huge emphasis on the right tool for the right job. And I think that comes into play too, because sometimes someone comes in and they're like, oh, this person's really gonna like do well with CBT, or this person's gonna be more of a psychodynamic. And sometimes it's like at first they're CBT, and maybe you take care of some of those, pressing issues, and then it kind of turns into a psychodynamic thing because you're going through years with them, right?
Yeah.
So, well, Dave, speaking of all this like personal talk, I have to say something to kind of lead us into this topic. And it's still gonna not seem like I'm leading into the topic, but have you read the Harry Potter books?
Never.
Really? Okay. So I'm going through them with my kids and I'm reading them to them, and it's actually kind of really fun. But I have to quote something really struck me. So Albus Dumbledore, I got to quote this guy. He's like the head guy, head wizard, right? Harry is all kind of worried and upset that all his sort of natural inclinations are for this house Slytherin, and he's really uncomfortable with that because he would rather like identify with this other house Gryffindor, right?
Yeah.
And when he tells us to this Albus Dumbledore, he says something great. He goes, "It's great that you feel that way. Like this is coming from like you have all these like inclinations that drive you in a certain way, but you do get to choose. What you choose to be is who you are." And it's like, oh yeah, Dumbledore, you're very Viktor Frankl right now. And that's great and true. We've definitely believed in that, you and I both. And as humans, or as mammals with the cortex over the rest of our brain, like all the animals have the limbic system, but we have that ability to rise above and rise above our circumstances and become who we truly are. But we also have the ability to deceive ourselves into being something we are not. So, and that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today with all this. I tell the students all the time that if we leave our phone or our wallet behind, right away, like if you leave it in your car, if you leave it in the office, right away, you know it. You're like, oh my God, where's my phone? Where's my wallet? It doesn't take a long time before you realize that. But you can lose yourself and not know it for a really long time. And that's something we're going to be talking about today. And Dave, why don't you like kind of just tell us like what exactly it is we're talking about today? Because I don't even know how to sort of name it.
Yeah. So as many know, June is Pride Month, a month that kind of, what's the word you want to use? Commemorates.
Sure.
I guess, it's a month for kind of just celebrating a community, which is the LGBTQ plus community, who in many ways have a very different journey than a lot of other individuals, right? And because the main reason for that journey is being different than most of us don't have to, at some point in time, make a decision. Do I want to tell my friends, loved ones, and possibly every stranger in the world my identity?
Yeah.
Most of us have an assumed identity, a surface level identity, I don't know, just one that like it's kind of assumed around you, right? For individuals in the LGBTQ plus community, that is not always the case, right? There's a lot of things about their identity that they hold the key to, and at some point can decide whether or not they want to share that with others. When I say the LGBTQ plus community, we're talking about lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, and plus is an inclusive term that basically is for anyone who doesn't fit any traditional categories of gender or sexuality. So this month, this Pride Month, feels like it's gotten bigger every single year, right? It's bigger, it's louder, it's brighter, literally brighter, because it's it's all about these bright colors. It's all about celebration. It's all about just pride, I guess would be the best way to put it, right? But ironically, in some cases, that's not the case for individuals, right?
Which
That
can be really difficult, right? Like not
exactly
being able to share who you are.
100%. So that right there is what we are hoping to be able to try to discuss, try to understand what that must lead to, must feel like, um, situations that can come about when you don't feel like you can come out.
Come out. So talk to us a little bit about what coming out.
What is coming out? All right.
Yeah.
So, well, actually, before I talk about coming out, I think it's important that we also
Well,
understand
I mean,
that
you're coming out on the air. I mean, interesting.
before we discuss what that means, it is important to understand that this is a community that, for many reasons, has a lot of higher rates of mental health issues, such as depression, self harm, alcohol and drug abuse, suicidal thoughts. Um, those are all things that tend to be heightened in this community. And, many reasons for that. Like I said, it could be because of discrimination, homophobia, transphobia, social isolation. I can't say it, rejection, but also because of difficult experiences coming out or because of never feeling like you can come out.
Right.
So back to what you were asking, what exactly is coming out? So coming out essentially is that term used for an individual who is going to inform somebody in their life of their sexuality or their identity in some way. And for some individuals, this can be exciting. It's uh, you feel like you're becoming yourself for the first time.
Mhm.
For others, it's very difficult. And for some, it's a combination of everything. Now, Greg, when we talk about coming out, does your first what's your first response of like what you think common reactions are?
So I think that obviously over the years the reactions have changed quite a bit. And you mean I think common reactions are probably these days, or in most cases, like, yeah, we knew that. What do you think? Like if
I
someone
think
comes out,
that's dependent. I mean, there's definitely, I'm sure, times,
yeah.
but that's kind of what this episode's is like about, because there are some people that have had to mask this very, very well. Not
Yeah, no,
everybody is that blanket, like, oh yeah, I kind of thought that, or or you had the stereotype, typical mannerisms or something like that I could tell. Um, there's a number of cases where that's not the case, right?
oh, absolutely. I've actually worked with people, and in the Navy, it was very sort of, I mean, contrary to what people might, the jokes and whatever. I
Mhm.
mean, there was a guy that I was in there with who, after 3.5 years of being friends with him, I found out he was gay, not even from him, and I just felt almost embarrassed. Like, why didn't you think that you could tell us that? And then when I thought about it a little bit harder, it's like, yeah, I guess it makes sense in a lot of ways because there would have been a lot of pressure. There might have been some pushback, and then when I think about it, here's a person, and when you talk about the difficulties with mental health, I can see that there's two huge themes that we're going to talk about that would, that affect your mental health quite a bit, and that's the authenticity and self-deceit. We talk about
Yeah.
both of those all the time, and the not being able to reveal your authentic self is it's damaging. It just is, right?
Right.
So to me, Freud, we talked about psychodynamic to start this thing off, but he hits it on the head when he was talking about the id ego and superego, and I'm talking about authenticity here. There's no doubt that framework is pretty solid. I mean, today when we talk about it, like psychiatrists and psychologists will talk about, there's a biological element to your personality. There's an environmental element, yeah, and then there's this other thing that's kind of a little more reflective, something that's specifically us, that's different from nature versus nurture, that's kind of chosen us, like those values that we see in the world, and then we identify with, and we're like, oh, that's who I am. Like that's an expression of who I am. And I think authenticity is when you feel inside And that feeling closely matches what you're showing other people on the outside, right? So we have our values and our beliefs. And I think that authenticity to me is living in accordance with those values and beliefs, and that's despite societal pressure or familial pressure or even danger. So especially in this community where it's like this becomes, it's easy to be yourself if you're me. It's easy to be yourself if you're you too, Dave. If not all the time, because we're put into situations where it's like, we have a decision to make that kind of goes against our values, but it would be easier if we just kind of went with the flow. But instead, just sticking up, like those examples. For example, like our phones. We both do this, and this is more of a self-deceit thing. But like all that time when I was figuring out that like, hey, these things are being made in like horrible conditions, and people are like killing themselves making these. I knew that, and I had to sort of like lie to myself and say, yeah, I'm not really. I didn't throw my phone away, so I went against my values. It wasn't exactly.
You used that exact analogy last episode, right?
Holy geez, I'm sorry. Must be in my mind, But like, here's an interesting take on authenticity. Then, like, let me put it like this. So there's you, Dave, right? And just another kind of idea about like what this is. There's two ways to look at it. So say you're Dave and you're going to a funeral, right? And you're there and you act very somber. And then later on that night, you go to a party and you're acting very, I don't know, festive, right? So that there's a part of you that like, if you went to the funeral and you were happy, you would still act somber. And if you went to the party, you would still you would act festive instead of, even if you felt somber. You know what I mean? So it's like this self-monitoring that we do that I think is authentic. But other people might say, hey, if you feel somber at a party, you should act somber at a party. Or if you feel like kind of lively at a funeral, that's how you should be. Like, that isn't that your authentic self? So it's really like a really difficult sort of concept, authenticity, right?
Yeah.
I mean, like, what are your thoughts on it?
So here's what makes it incredibly challenging, or just kind of like really kind of highlights the difficulty that an individual who is hiding their identity would face. Imagine, so we're like, our examples of being inauthentic or having to possibly mask at times involve situational examples for the most part.
Yeah.
Imagine your entire existence is living opposite of the way that you would actually want to live your life. For fear, for expectation, for maybe even like
for love.
I guess.
You know what I mean? Think about it, your family, right? Like that.
Well,
could
yeah,
be
yeah.
A fear, right? I mean,
or
I could lose my family,
religion, or
absolutely
societal expectations, for safety.
And like, I bet you a lot of the times it's like, even when I've had patients, extremely religious patients who have sort of tried to convince themselves for long periods of time that they're not. So it's like, you're not only trying to deceive the outside world and the important people in it, also you're trying to deceive yourself, which is kind of,
well, there are people who I've actually heard them kind of talk about that, like self-loathing. Like their views of homosexuality are that it's wrong, that it's gross, that it's, they have all these negative feelings. And then they start to actually hate themselves as those thoughts start to pop up, that that's part of who they are actually.
Mm-hmm.
So they start to hate themselves. And part of coming out for them is actually learning to love yourself and learning there's nothing wrong with those feelings because that's just who you are. But imagine for those people who can't. Every day of their life, you live in accordance to somebody else's expectation of how you're supposed to act.
You've completely, now we've talked a million times about how like the choices that you make are your identity. You're absolutely denying your own existence.
So when we talk about mental health issues, we talk about, anxiety, depression, substance abuse. No wonder why the experiences are so much higher of those mental health issues for individuals in that community. Half of that community, of the LGBTQ community, has experienced depression, and 3 in 5 actually have experienced like significant anxiety. So it's majority, right?
Right.
1 in 8 people aged 18 to 24 have attempted to end their life. That's a startling amount. 1 in 8.
Yeah.
And almost half of all trans people have thought about taking their life. There's obvious like correlation here to this idea of like identity and how you're accepted, and also how you're accepting yourself and how you're living your life, and mental health. And one of the things that has, been seen in recent studies is that people who have come out tend to have less of these, or a decreased rate of some of these mental health issues. And that feels significant, like a significant fact. So, I mean, a little bit later, we'll talk about more reasons why some people don't come out and why some people do. But that just feels important when we're talking about authenticity. We're talking about living your life by your values. And for these people who aren't able to, how they must experience life.
Yeah. Now, I wonder too, like in those cases where you obviously see this, side of it too, where people, it's almost like an intrusive thought that they try to push away, but it's not. It's like who they are. And so they begin to hate that, and they hate everything that represents. And then sometimes you see that, sort of turn into violence and hatred towards the gay community when they're denying that part of themselves.
One thing that's like very common to hear from parents is, because I mean, we've all heard about those stories about, a parent that has a negative reaction to their child coming out. One thing that I've heard, even from parents who maybe weren't like, it wasn't like overly negative, or, it was like surprised maybe, or just like concerned or worried, is like that fear of, my child is going to have a harder life because of this now, right?
Well, you just named a bunch of stats, right? So maybe that's part of, like, that's part of the parents.
But I feel like part of that is like, if the parent understands what that individual needs in order to avoid some of those stats, some of that harder road, like it'd be so much better if we could get into a place where people are automatically starting to think of that instead of
also like,
God, you're gonna have a bad life,
from like a parent's point of view, right? You got to kind of ask yourself, like, why does this make me upset? Am I really concerned about my child's well-being if I'm, sort of upset with their authenticity? And or is it more like, I'm going to be embarrassed, or like,
I always wonder
you're not going to fit it in your church, or whatever it is.
I do always wonder that, how much of it is the parents like, this is a reflection of me? Because
how does this make me look?
Most of the time when an individual, or a child does something wrong, isn't that a thing that's prevalent on the parents' minds?
Yeah.
Like, oh, my kid's embarrassing me in front of all these other parents. Oh, people are going to think that I'm not a good parent. Like, we're always talking about that, about parents and having those anxious thoughts or those intrusive thoughts about not being a good parent, and how, how other people are seeing them as a parent. So you've got to imagine that this is something that's on their mind when their child comes out to them.
Yeah, and I'd want to hear more of that. Obviously that's not something I've experienced yet. I mean, you never know. And I like to think that I would be pretty open and accepting, and I think that like most people in my circle wouldn't be an issue. But I know people, obviously, and older people in my family who it would be an issue, right? They would make them feel like pretty terrible about it, and it would, I think, be mainly rooted in religion.
Yeah.
And then I don't know what I don't know what why it's so natural to kind of have an aversion to that, but it's a stigma. And I think you have to admit, though, it's becoming less of a problem. Do you think?
I wouldn't say that, but I would say overall acceptance is increasing. I wouldn't say it's less of a problem, because that feels like a statement that someone could probably make us eat. So I would
Yeah, no,
probably say
yeah.
awareness and acceptance, I hope, is increasing. There's a lot. All right, no, actually, let me rephrase it. Here's what I think. There's more communal support than ever for individuals, and there's way more people who don't even identify as part of the community who are involved with the community as, like, quote unquote allies, or however you want to frame it.
Right.
I think that piece is getting larger and better and more supportive. I still think there's obviously room to grow.
Yeah. So here's
Goes
my
without
thing,
telling.
though. It feels like when I was in school, there was seemingly hardly any homosexuality, or like it was a very select few, right? Is there an opposite sort of thing that's happening here? Like, is there any danger that there's some self-deceit and some lack of authenticity in people who are coming out as gay, but they're not gay, just so they can kind of, or even transgender, just so they can have a community that they couldn't have had before? Like, it almost is like this built-in sort of support group for certain kids who maybe feel like they're on the fringes, and this isn't their difference, but they sort of
Well,
jump
let's be
onto that.
honest. What kid truly knows themselves until they are 30 to 40? Like, what person
Hey,
really
look,
knows who they are?
and that's why, like, honestly,
So
I differ from a lot of therapists, and I can't speak for you, where like I would never advocate for any kind of like, yeah, you're right. You don't know yourself until, I mean, geez, certainly not until your late teens. I don't know. Then you have
I
start to
think
have a little
I
bit of
think
idea of who you are.
you can start to get an idea, but I mean, there's so much growing that happens constantly. I'm not saying an individual doesn't know their preferences, but what I
Oh,
am
sexual
saying is
preferences, yeah, but
there is
I was
so much room to grow.
my mind was
And
thinking more of a transgender thing there.
okay,
You know what I mean? Where it's like sometimes people will advocate for like biological changes in
you've
their
already had this conversation on here.
yeah. Last episode?
No, not last episode.
Okay. So another part of this, and I maybe the opposite of authenticity, is self-deceit. And I mean, if you listen to this podcast, we talked about this in a million different ways, where how dangerous this could be. But sometimes, like, the reasons why we deceive ourselves or live sort of deceptively is for survival, avoidance, and you know, it's sort of the things we tell ourselves to make it okay to deny doing what we know to be right, or in this case, what we know to be natural. So how can this be dangerous? Like, you're not living your own choices. You're outsourcing your choices. And that's sort of a dangerous thing. Like, I was in the Navy with this guy who he did something that was really against his values. And let's just say, like, he did something where he engaged in relations with someone who, who was probably not in the best situation, and it was a transactional thing, and he kind of like made all these he lied to himself in various different ways that made him feel better about the things that he did. And as time went on,
Was it like a same sex thing?
It wasn't, but it was almost like from what I gather, it was like a almost like a trafficking situation, where like you went to this bar and we're in the Middle East, and there were these people there who were, obviously, like, there was like vacant eyes, and I think part of his self-deceit was like, he was like, part of the self-deceit initially was like, oh, they really wanted him. Another part of the self-deceit was like, there was something even like supernatural about it, where it was like possessed or something. Different ways to kind of like make it feel like what he did was okay. And he just told himself that forever. And then I remember hearing a story, years later, he had children and he had daughters, and he went to therapy, and he was for years like extremely suicidal and had to spend weeks in hospitals, because after denying like what he was doing all this time, like having daughters, and like really facing and having to turn around and face that himself, that he'd been lying to himself all this time, he completely destroyed his own identity. He had no idea who he was. He'd just been kind of living a life for so long that he didn't want to live anymore. So this is a dangerous thing. And I don't know how those two things compare. I just know that if this is who you are, and obviously I don't know, the science behind it all, right? But I do know that I've known many people in my life who are homosexual, and that's just who they are. And I can't imagine having to deny that for years and years and years, and it can't be good. It can't end well, right?
I always think it's interesting when you hear the stories, and for some whatever reason in my mind, I think of like that, and I've brought up this reference before, but like that Mad Men, the show,
Yeah,
Don
yeah.
Draper, all them. I always think of this like time period as a time like where that must have been rampant, where like individuals married, big families, but they're closet, they're in the closet still. And they're having like maybe these little affairs, on the side with other men, or vice versa, women as well. And it's
Like Vito from The Sopranos.
yeah. I almost feel like for those individuals, like because maybe it didn't even feel like coming out was an option, right? Because they felt like it wouldn't be accepted. They felt like, it would destroy my life. They couldn't picture, living that life authentic. So
Dude, I
they
can say
use
to you,
self-deceit to
yeah.
kind of convince themselves that they're happy, and they build this life. And you know what? Maybe there are moments of happiness in there. But is it the same happiness that you can experience living an authentic life that's been built and has things that have actual meaning and purpose? Like I'm sure for someone who's, in this fraudulent marriage, maybe having kids is a really happy thing. Maybe
Yeah.
raising kids can be. I actually was listening to a story of a dad who, he was married and his son came out as gay. And the dad kind of realized as he was talking to his son that like he's also gay. And his wife, and he started to talk to his wife about it afterwards. And then she kind of started to question him. And I thought that was like an interesting story. Like it almost came like he was relating so hard to the things that his son had experienced. And he probably always knew all along, but he's like, he was hiding it to himself, or he was convincing himself, like you said, maybe like denying some of those intrusive thoughts that he was experiencing. And then when his son came out, it's like, oh, all right.
So what's the end of that story? That's kind of interesting because it's like here's his chance to really, it's almost like we can live better through our kids. It's like, can he say, don't hold back on this? Like,
yeah, he's
please.
a prominent figure in like advocating for like mental health and in this community as well.
So what happened? And the wife must be like, oh boy, I guess.
That I don't know. But I mean, I've heard of stories where they're like where it's able to still continue as whether it's a friendship or an actual relationship or a partnership. I'm trying to remember. There's actually this couple. I was trying to think of who it was. Yeah, it's not coming to my head right now.
But that's a perfect example of how like that inauthentic life can is as damaging as it is to you. It can be really damaging to others too.
Absolutely.
I mean, that wife
or that person can be a very caring and empathetic and accepting person and want to just support and still like carve out some sort of life together still, where maybe that it doesn't mean it's the end of their partnership. It's the end of their romantic relationship, perhaps.
Yeah.
But I mean,
really
everybody's case is different. Everybody's life is different. Everybody's situation is different. And I think it's just so important for us to all remember that, and not like even us just assuming right away. And it feels like a very natural assumption that it must have destroyed the marriage, and like they must hate each other, and the wife must be so spiteful and vengeful and feel like she got the rug pulled over her head, like all those things. Who's to say, right? Who's to say?
Yeah.
That's us putting our like societal expectation on how someone's supposed to feel, and everybody is just so different. So yeah. So why should people come out, Greg?
Well, I think because I think that you get one life, and why not live it authentically? I mean, authentically. I mean, you literally, sometimes if you really think about it like that, and it's hard to do, you get one chance at this. Why not try to be as happy as you can? And happiness isn't something that like you can, you don't land on it and you can't really like work towards it really, but just living a meaningful, authentic life. If you do that, happiness is going to happen to you. It's going to ensue you.
Well, and the biggest thing is to understand that when you live a authentic life, a life
Yeah.
based on your values, and a life based on making decisions based on who you are now taking control and ownership of who you are. You're not just being a puppet, pretty much, right?
Yeah.
You're not being pulled by the strings of what societal or whoever's expectations are of you and what decision you're supposed to make. You are now in the driver's seat, and what a special place to be, because now you have the ability to decide what direction you go. The other big
what's great
part,
about that is great. That's a very existential kind of frame of mind for it, because you're right. It's here I am. Like you're going to, if you have this, like so say, like let's be honest, homosexual, not homosexual, like any kind of, wherever you are on the spectrum of this, you're going to suffer. We're all going to suffer. If you hide this from yourself and the world, you're going to suffer. You are. If you reveal it to the world, you're going to suffer. It can bring about some suffering. Absolutely. And that's just going to happen no matter what choice we make. But at least if you're authentic, you get to choose your manner of suffering.
yeah,
Right?
I think it's important to remember that suffering is inevitable for all of us.
Yes.
We're all going to suffer at some point.
No matter
So
what.
we cannot always live a life where we're avoiding suffering. I think another huge part of the reason that it's beneficial to come out is you immediately build community, other people you identify with. And I don't mean by like saying it out loud, suddenly all these people come into your home. It's like, no, you now have your identity, you've announced who you are, and you can seek out spaces where you have supports, or even online, or however you experience life or want to experience life. You have the ability now to have community with other people who identify as you.
And there's a word for that feeling that you're going to have once you sort of make that really brave declaration. And it's called pride.
Yes.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, really?
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It is. And other people, when you feel like other people identify as like you, I imagine it must be even more significant when you identify that as something that's considered, I guess, quote unquote minority,
Yeah.
or outside of the common, right?
Yeah.
When you find other people identify with you, it must be like such a strong and impactful feeling to be like, wow, all right, here I have been living my life this way, feeling like people don't understand me, feeling like I'm not able to be myself. And now I've found these people that understand me, maybe have some shared experiences, maybe different experiences, but similar themes. And we can share that with each other. That's a powerful thing. And you also now have access to supports that are included in this community. Certain specific professionals, kind of specialists sometimes. There might be, like, even in our profession, there might be some therapists that are considered like specialized for that community.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. I think most individuals in the practice that we're in work with individuals in the community. We don't have anyone that's like, oh, you got it.
Yeah, no one's really specialized in it. It's just kind of like, well,
yeah,
or whatever. But like like you were talking about that sense of belonging, that sense of understanding, and that's what we're talking about in the beginning. That's why therapy works, because you do, once you do feel sort of understood and seen, and you get a sense of hope, and you start feeling better immediately.
Yeah,
like what we immediately, I think.
There's this quote that I found from Robert Paul Juster. He's an assistant research professor and lead authority on some studies. And his quote was, "Lesbians, gay men, and bisexuals who were out to family and friends had lower levels of psychiatric symptoms and lower morning cortisol levels than those who were still in the closet."
Okay, wow. So
and my question to that is, like, I mean, I think we've answered it like 15 times already. Why?
Well, you don't have to face the day. I mean,
Yeah.
cortisol, I mean, for those that don't know, or like the stress hormones, your body releases that when it's under stress. And you're if you're waking up with cortisol, that means that you're afraid to approach the day because it's a day of deceiving, a day of hiding. That's not a
Right.
natural good feeling.
So it
And
just
if you
goes
don't
to
have to do
prove
that,
they're waking up with stress, with
yeah,
anxiety, with depression, right?
yeah, not
Another
good.
interesting stat. Um, a study published in the Journal of Adolescent Health found that when young transgender people use their chosen names, they have reported fewer incidents of suicidal thoughts and behaviors, as well as less depressive symptoms. Again, this kind of goes into this idea of living authentically and just kind of taking ownership of who you are, I think.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That's all part of it.
So why do some people not come out? This was actually easier to find reasons for, in all honesty, than reasons people did choose to come out, and that's kind of sad.
Yeah, no, so I didn't look up this at all, but I bet you I can name a few.
Go ahead if you want to try. Yeah.
I mean, so obviously, you know, alienated by your family,
Yes. Yep.
religion, would probably be a big one. Maybe even like your employment or your friend group.
Yeah.
Like, you're afraid of losing. So we're social creatures, right? So anything that's going to, I mean, from an evolutionary standpoint, anything that's going to threaten our social status or our groups, and to threaten our status in those groups, we're going to have an aversion to. We're going to be anxious about. So it's got to be what this is about.
Not even just worrying about being rejected, but also not wanting to be singled out or feel like now there's a spotlight with excessive responsibility because maybe they're like the only person who identifies within like maybe a workplace or like a friend group. You know what I mean? Like in
Yeah,
a workplace,
yeah,
maybe
yeah.
feeling like you have to speak for all the individuals in that community because you're the only one, like being the token one, right? So that's one of the reasons. A very big and real concern is safety. And I know it's easy for us to like say, oh, you can't let fears get in the way. And for some, though, that's more than just a fear. Um, the risk of assault, whether it's just verbal or like physical, is real in some communities. So that is something that a person should really be mindful of when they're coming out, or has to be mindful of. Am I safe if I come out? It's some communities maybe not as accepting as we are up here in the Northeast. And even in the Northeast,
Oh,
there's communities
yeah,
that maybe aren't as
absolutely.
accepting. Our high school experiences, I think I'm glad to hear that like it's better from when we were in high school, which I mean, it was a long time ago, but it wasn't that long ago. Um, but like I would have been terrified to come out if I was an individual coming out back in like the early 2000s in my school.
It's a good point. Yeah, it's a good point.
And then we obviously we know of like some of those stories like Matthew Shepard, and there's a plethora of stories about violence towards individuals in that community. Um, Here's one that I was thinking, and I had heard a story about from a woman that kind of gave me this conclusion. It might be easier for some than others. And when I say that is the woman in this article, she described herself as white, cisgender, thin, able-bodied, and she lives in New York. So this is a quote from her. So while it was still nerve-wracking to leave my marriage and tell everyone why, I did so knowing I'll still walk through the world without necessarily being visibly queer unless I'm with a partner. And while feeling I don't look queer enough does sometimes make me feel invisible, it's also something that may save me from experiencing the violence many others go through. So I think that's kind of an interesting thought. Like for some, it might be easier if you know your family is going to be more accepting. If you know just by your appearance, maybe you'll be more accepted in the world, or maybe kind of be able to breeze through the world without people like seeing you, right?
Mhm.
It's probably easier for people that feel that. versus someone who's like, if I come out, everyone's going to know, it's going to be this big thing. Yeah, I don't know exactly what it is about that, like what would make one person have an easier experience, but I can say obviously a white cisgender woman would probably have a much better experience than like anybody, any other ethnicity, maybe a trans individual. Yeah, I don't know. I could come up with a bunch of different characteristics that would make it a lot harder in living in a place where you're way more visible than New York City, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. And even like just thinking about that right now, like if another way to think about it is you in your life right now, or me in my life right now, you can think of people, you don't have to name them or anything, but like you could probably, if you had to come out as gay right now, you could kind of feel that anxiety and like the people that I have certain people in my mind, the people who would not be okay with that, right?
Mhm.
And so, I mean, you can just kind of imagine how it feels just in that sense. Like, do you know? So, and I guess we can get this, like, sort of. Do you have any examples, or do you have any patients that are going through this, or is that inappropriate? Do you feel appropriate, like, talking about that? I mean, I won't give any names, but I have a couple people who I've seen clearly kind of push this back, clearly still not willing to accept this about themselves. It's not a conversation that we're having. The difficulties of coming out. It's they're not even willing to admit. And there's been instances,
You might as well just go into the story.
yeah. So there's been instances of I don't want to tell the story too accurately. If you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So it's like there's been instances of sexual contact, same sexual contacts, and throughout the entire life. And that's just not been a part of this person's culture. That's not been a part of this person's upbringing. In fact, it was extremely opposite, to the point where it was like comments are made about homosexuality. You know what I mean? Despite having engaged in behavior. And so this person, stays in relationships with, cis, hetero relationships, and they've become violent. And this person deals with a lot of anger. And it's just, I'm watching this happen, and I'm kind of like grasping at straws on how to like sort of unravel all this. And it's almost like if this is revealed to this person, it's almost, I worry how much self-loathing will come from that before healing.
Sure.
Really difficult to, like, web that this has kind of become with this person. And it's interesting, but it's also like heartbreaking, and that this person would never feel accepted by those in his life. It would go against everything, that the identity that he has created is starkly different than the identity that gets so far apart, like the person inside from the person being portrayed, that it's staggering and scary. And I've seen that it becomes dangerous.
Sure.
So it's in these cases, it's like, oh, it would like the brave thing, if it's a macho thing, the brave thing is to face your identity and accept who you are and present it to the world, because that's going to be scarier than hiding it.
Yeah. But it doesn't feel to me like it's a matter of bravery.
Yeah.
It feels different for most of these cases, because it feels like there's so much going against a person. And there's so much for them to consider, and there's so much for them to, and here's the other thing. And this was another thing that, like, why some people might not want to come out. It's like the only thing you actually have control over is that once you say it, it's out. And I heard somebody say it this way. Once you put it out there, it's everybody else's choice what they do with it. You no longer have control. So you are essentially allowing yourself to be put in the most vulnerable situation. You have no idea how relationships will go. You could lose like you said before, you could lose everything. You could lose family, you could lose friends. Um, Everything could change, or it could be a great experience.
Yeah, so that's the thing. I think it's not. It probably won't be either or. It'll probably be somewhere in between, just like everything else. Like you're not going to be able to control the storm that comes in. The only thing you're going to be able to do is adjust your sails. That's just life in general. And that's if there's any advice, it's always try to live as authentically as possible,
or at least
I mean,
make choices. The thing that we didn't address is you don't just come out once. You have to come out again and again and again. What a tedious thing, also, considering what you're doing. All you're doing is basically saying who you are, but now you have to do it in like all the domains of your life if you choose to, or maybe one if you don't feel comfortable doing all of them. So like that first experience though is really important, because that if you're invalidated, if you're rejected from that first experience, that might turn you off from coming out ever again.
Yeah, that's
and
true.
you might continue to hide your identity. So there's so many different elements and layers to this. I just had one example of someone I'm working with. I'm going to give very vague details, obviously. But this is an individual I've been working with for years now. And when I first met her, she had just been basically excommunicated from her church. She was very involved. She had family that was involved in the church. She was super involved. It was a big sense of community for her. She actually had been in a relationship with a woman prior. They had a bad breakup, and the church really gave her a sense of community at a time where she needed it most. And then they found out that she was having a relationship with another member in the church, and they basically said you have to end the relationship, or you're not allowed back. So she stopped going to the church, and that was devastating to her, and it left her feeling empty. Left her feeling like she lost not just the church but also her family that went to the church, and she has struggled for years now with emptiness, depression, anxiety, just embracing life. And it's not like she wasn't out. It was one of those situations where she's just like, I just didn't think I needed to say it, announce it. Like, it's not like I was hiding it. I was in a relationship before this. And then she started to understand, and it came very clear to her that like they kind of knew all along, but they were in a way trying to change her, heal her is a way that they would say it. They were trying to bring her to the Lord, which was their way of trying to make her straight. And she started to come to these conclusions throughout the past few years, but building this person back up and helping them understand that they should be accepted. There's no, there's community out there for them.
There's churches out there for them.
Yeah,
for sure. Right.
The experience they had in it was just so strong that it's just like it going somewhere else and doing this all over again. No.
Okay.
They couldn't even listen to church music.
That's too bad.
It was without like having, distress. So it was really sad. And I didn't think things like this still existed when we talk about like churches and, they're.
I know like you must be talking, that's supposed to be pretty antiquated, because if the Catholic churches have gotten like okay with it,
right.
It's I mean,
interesting, right? Yeah, it really felt something so outdated. I was like really surprised. But anyways, so yeah, these are just, a couple, just a small little amount of examples of situations and how people endure these feelings after. So yeah. Greg, any final thoughts?
I mean, I think that's it for me, except for that whole generation of people who I have people in my family that I don't even know if they would know I'm talking about them, that are clearly homosexual, but lived their lives in a, like if they lived a very limiting sort of lonely life because of all the social constructs that they kind of like grew up around. But it was the church and it was
Yeah.
family and it wasn't okay. And they constantly heard that it wasn't okay. So what they're hearing is like, as they're hearing that, no one knows that they're telling them, hey, it's not okay to be you. That sucks. That sucks.
But like, we kind of pointed out earlier, I'm sure that they've created some sort of life worth living. And
Yeah.
even if it's not their full authentic self, maybe they'll never experience that. At least they've built a life worth it for them, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, of course, there's many elements of life and you can always find meaning in different areas of life. It's just sad that like you had to be limited in that way. But as we evolve,
can I point out something that you said earlier that like I think is kind of part of the reason why some people don't feel comfortable coming out? And I know that I like even from people that I've hung out with, I can see how like I've probably been guilty of this, especially as a youth. Like us growing up early 2000s, late 90s, horrible mindsets, horrible statements came out of our mouths, and it was like different times. And
although like I think the intentions were never sort of malicious.
Sometimes,
just sort of like.
But I've heard some pretty crappy things.
Okay.
And I've seen some pretty crappy things. But like you said, like in the Navy, like aside from jokes about it, like most people would probably still conceal their identity, right? And then you said, well, there was this one guy, and like I don't know why he didn't feel comfortable. I think that's part of it. It's kind of said in this like laughing nature a lot of times as jokes.
Yeah.
That almost makes like if you're making a joke of it, you're kind of pointing out that there's this general idea that there's something wrong with it. So if like I'm the one that's feeling like, oh, I want to tell people, and then I hear all this, it probably makes me feel like I don't want to be the butt of these jokes.
Yeah.
Or like,
that's true.
Oh, listen to how they're talking about it. Like I had a friend that I'm not friends with anymore, but he used to make like he would be like, oh, like he would go to the pride parades, and I always thought this was funny because he was also the same guy that would make like gay jokes towards myself or another friend or something, and I'm kind of like, I don't know how those two things correlate. I get it. It's a joke, but what is, if you're making a joke out of it, you're kind of saying there's like, you're teasing someone about it.
Yeah.
Do you get what I'm saying? Like,
no, totally.
I have
absolutely.
a point, but like, I don't know if I'm making it clear enough. And I wonder, and not saying people shouldn't joke around. And I know that we have our views about comedy, and like, I think the Tom Brady roast was a great example of people kind of feeling like, let's get back to saying inappropriate things again for comedy, because that's kind of what comedy is all about.
Yeah, which I'm all for.
But at the same time, if there's consistent themes amongst small groups of friends, I think it gives a general idea that like there's a view of that theme, right? It's like you're speaking about that thing. So why would someone feel comfortable saying like, oh, but that's me? Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I know. I get that. Yeah, that's another difficult sort of long conversation that we'd have to have.
I'm sure there's arguments on both sides.
Yeah,
like,
because
it almost like makes it like nature.
Sort of like
I totally can see that, and maybe that would be the intention for the person who doesn't identify it. But I would love to hear someone who maybe, if someone identifies as gay and was spent a lot of time around individuals doing that, like how did that give you confidence to come out and make you feel like they would accept you, or did it actually make you more concerned? That's a question I would have. I don't have an answer for that. That's more of like something I've put thought into, because I'm like, I wonder what that, like, because I often think about that. We were talking about the high school experiences. I had one individual who came out in our high school, and then there was others that like we knew, and then later after high school came out. And I always wondered, like, what was it about our high school or our community at that time that like made it so uncomfortable for individuals to kind of be able to do that. And there was a lot of that kind of joking happening at the time, right? I mean, we're talking about the time where Eminem came out, and like he was very infamous for that stuff too. And like, and it was just a general, DMX was horrible with that stuff too, if you ever listen to his songs. But it was just like this way of like banter for like adolescent boys, right?
Well, dude, honestly, when I hear people like really going all real heavy on like the like kind of crapping on homosexuals, it's like I remember being young and being like, well, you're spending an awful lot of time on that. Like I
Yeah.
remember thinking like
Yeah.
it's like an overcompensation. It's you're trying to don't look at me too close. Or like obviously I'm not, right? Because
I'm not the one spending all this time talking about it.
yeah.
Right.
So
Yeah.
but like even them it's like, hey, don't think I'm not gay. Look how much I hate gays. You know what I mean? That's so when I think like a lot of times like those were people who were,
Overcompensation.
like struggling with those
100%.
emotions,
Yeah. Yep.
and it's like oh man, that sucks to have to feel that way, to have to hate what you are.
Yeah.
It's wild.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting conversation.
Okay. All right. Everybody, thank you so much for listening to this episode. We're just going to wrap up with a little bit of fan mail. So we got 3 interesting pieces of fan mail that we will read. Thank you for everyone who has given us some fan mail. Even just saying the word fan mail sounds
It feels good.
crazy. Yeah. So here is a person who had actually messaged us back in May, which I believe we read. Yes, we did. It was the one where his teacher also listens, which was awesome. I said he, but I meant she. But then now again in June, just recently, last week, we were messaged again. It said, "Hi, my name is Chloe. I've previously sent a message this way, and I was wondering if you could consider doing an episode on Gothic culture and its origins. Just a suggestion." As soon as I read that, I was like, absolutely. I think that would be great. I have a question though. When they say Gothic, are we talking about like 80s goth, or are we talking about like Gothic from like Victorian, like vampires and
Oh, dude, I think it's all encompassing.
Is it?
Yeah,
it evolves.
Not even 80s goth, like 90s. I'm wearing nylons on my arms and listening to, I don't know, 9 Inch Nails or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
Kind of dating myself now. My Chemical Romance nowadays, or not even nowadays, maybe 20
Well,
years.
we do have an emo episode down the pike too, which I think
okay, emo.
Some of that, but like goth, I think is its own thing too, and that
Gothic is awesome.
Yeah, I definitely want to do this, and I'm just wondering, is that all in one, or are those 2 separate things?
I want to say, to me, I immediately think of like wrought iron fences and Victorian times and graveyards and like just like Gothic culture.
Chloe, if you're listening, message us again.
Yeah,
fan mail us again, and let us know which Gothic you mean. I'm down for whichever. Examples. I'm actually totally down for both. I think both. I think actually goths from like high school would be an amazing episode to do as well.
Yeah.
So
my sister was totally
into that. Was she?
My sister was very goth
too. Actually. Yeah. Doc Martens and
Doc Martens,
crazy hair colors. Yeah. Yep.
Pretty cool. Right. So listen, this one's from Winder, Georgia. And it says, "Hey y'all, huge fan of the podcast. I just did a little Southern accent by accident.
I know.
I look forward to every new episode. I'm finishing this week's episode on the Middle Passage, and it reminded me of the conditions of the Holocaust. I think an episode on this topic would be fascinating, whether it's covering the events and the atrocities that took place, uncovering the effects on survivors, or any ideas you have. Please keep up your amazing work." And see, I love this idea too, because there has been actually a lot of research done on survivors of the Holocaust. I mean, of course, we have a favorite or a couple favorites, but like their resilience throughout the rest of their life is incredible. So it's almost like they could not have been the person they were had it not been for this awful thing. Not that they want it to happen again, not that they thought it was a good thing, but they wouldn't have had a meaningful life had it not happened, which is an interesting thing. Yeah. After that, pretty much everything was easy, I think. But yeah, no, a great idea for an episode. The Holocaust. I mean, if you are interested and you haven't gone through them all, I don't know how much we got into the Holocaust on the Viktor Frankl Man's Search for Meaning episode.
Yeah, a little bit
in there, and the Romani. So, but it deserves its own for sure.
Our last one comes from the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. It says, I'm starting to properly explore Munchausen's and by proxy, having been raised by a woman who undoubtedly had this. My mother definitely fell into this vortex of traits and behaviors. I've just come across this podcast from last year. Really interesting discussion, folks. Definitely thought provoking. Thanks, lads. Royson. I don't know if I said that wrong. Awesome.
I like lads.
I love it all. I love it all. Hopefully I'll see you one day in person when I go to Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Right.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this was great to be able to do a topic that I feel needed. I feel like, while we don't necessarily represent the community the best, I think just being able to talk about this and shed our understanding of it, I'm hoping will help provoke some thought for others who maybe haven't thought about this enough. I don't know. We'll see.
Maybe it's a little push. Maybe
it's interesting because I think, Greg, like you said, I feel like it's something that people are going to eventually forget where it came from, right?
Yeah.
Because like you said, it's starting to feel like it's very accepted, like it's better. So it's important for people to remember that even though we see the highlights, we see it in media, we see it on TV, we see, celebrities, and we see the pride parades and we see the celebrations. We have to remember that just because we see those highlights doesn't mean that their journeys are easy or they're ever going to be easy. There's no cut and dry way of coming out. Everybody's experience is a little bit different. And for many, there's a lot of rocky roads they have to face. And it's an experience that a lot of us just can't fully relate to completely because we don't ever have to do it. So I just have a lot of empathy and compassion for that. And I hope that that was able to come across in our conversation today. So yeah, thanks everybody again. If you want to contact us, you know where to find us. Fan mail, which you can find right on the app you're listening to this from. If you're on YouTube, message us on YouTube. We got some great interaction on there. I really love those conversations people are having with us. You can also email us, utgnpodcast@gmail.com. But most importantly, we really would love for everybody to be able to share a rating and review. The best way, or the way that we would love most, is if you could do that on Apple Podcasts, because you can actually write a review, but you can rate on any app that you listen to. And also, if you're interested in being a part of our community, we do have the subscriptions page where people can donate whatever they feel necessary to help keep this going and to help support the podcast. So yeah, that's just a number of ways that you can get connected. We're on all social medias and all that good stuff. Whew, that was a lot.
That was a lot, but you got through it.
Yeah. All right, everybody. Have a great night. We'll see you next week. Peace out.
Peace out.